Thank you, Mr. Chair, for giving me the floor again. On behalf of the Indian Law Resource Center, we thank you for the opportunity to comment on the standards and criteria for accrediting Indigenous governing institutions. Regarding accreditation standards, first, we must point out that the new category for participation should apply exclusively to Indigenous peoples' governing institutions, which may also be known as customary, traditional, or constitutional governments, Indigenous parliaments, assemblies, or councils. Such institutions must govern Indigenous peoples, as that term is used and understood in the United Nations and in other intergovernmental bodies. We feel the elements for discussion paper sets out a very good starting point for the standards and criteria to be employed by the Accreditation Committee, and we thank you for including those. Importantly, these standards are also in keeping with over 30 years of UN practice and custom. And focusing this process on Indigenous governing institutions specifically, or what is called Indigenous Peoples Representative Institutions, will ensure their most meaningful and effective participation while also using the least amount of limited UN and other resources, including those of Indigenous applicants. To further assist in the application of existing and emerging international standards and customary practice, we'd like to propose a three-part criteria for Indigenous peoples to be accredited, Indigenous governing institutions to be accredited. They should be accredited, in our view, if they demonstrate, first, that they represent a people, second, that the people is Indigenous, and third, that the government is duly constituted. The first requirement is that the government represent a people, that is, a people distinct from others and having shared bonds of history, language, culture, location, self-government, or other social or political bonds. Second, the people must be shown to be Indigenous, as that term is used in practice and understood in the UN generally and other international and intergovernmental bodies, such as the ILO, the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and as discussed in the Martinez-Cobo study from 1983. Such common elements these sources use to identify Indigenous peoples are outlined in the elements paper and include descent from a people existing prior to the development of the present state or prior to conquest or colonization, connection to an ancestral territory, having distinct social, economic, cultural, and political institutions, and self-identification as a distinct people. The people must not be an ethnic, national, linguistic, racial, or other group that is not, in fact, Indigenous. That is not the intended result of this exercise. This is both a question of fact and history, and it cannot be determined by self-identification alone, but no particular definition should be required, which is similar to the approach and practice of accrediting NGOs and national human rights institutions, which are two processes for participation which do not require a particular definition, but rather application of a set of criteria and standards. The third requirement we mentioned is that the government be duly constituted by and therefore genuinely representative of the Indigenous people it purports to represent. So I was glad to hear that mentioned by the advisors today. Naturally, such a government must be representative of, responsible, and accountable to the people, though no particular form of government should be required. However, I want to point out in the elements paper, because some duly established and genuinely representative Indigenous governments are appointed by traditional authorities, we caution against requiring proof of a government's democratic election as an essential element in its accreditation, as some are appointed. Regarding the application process, initially an applicant should be requested to provide documentation or other reliable evidence establishing their existence as a governing institution, and we feel this could include written and oral testimony or statements with a brief description of the people, the Indigenous nation or community it represents, the governing powers or authority it exercises, and the principal officials or office holders in the government. A government that meets these and other related requirements should be accredited to participate permanently, subject to periodic reporting on a reasonable basis, and the accredited government would then designate individuals to represent it in particular UN meetings. And we are also in favor of what was recommended earlier about a potential 5-year review of the body, selection body, and accreditation mechanism. Thank you.